ケイドに物語はありません。
That line can unfortunately apply to a lot more Precure seasons than writers these days. Yep, it's time for another Precure / Common Writer Doujinshi review. This one coming from the Gikko Gakko Do Circle. Geez, that sounds like a Yu-Gi-Oh monster. And just like the Show Writers vs. Heisei Precure book we covered in the past, this is actually an anthology featuring several different artists contributing their own stories, featuring individual Precure teams and characters. And like that review, we're just gonna focus on the main story that's featured on the cover. We might cover some of those other stories another day. I mean, some of them are pretty damn hilarious. But for once on this channel, I think we should just properly focus on the main subject. With that, let's take a look at Decade Precure and see if we can't keep Naratake at bay at least for a little while. Sorry, I thought I heard an honore there for a second. Let's just get this started. The cover for this one is very nicely done, featuring Miyuki and Mana in the forefront, while all of the other previous leads are in the background. It's kind of impressive that they managed to fit everyone while having our two main starting characters take up so much space. Then again, this is also coming out when we weren't totally overloaded with the seasons. But yeah, this book was originally released on June 9th of 2013 at the Precure Festa 10. That just so happened to be the same day episode 19 of Doki Doki aired, and about 3 months after New Stage 2 was released in theaters, which this story will make reference to, though thankfully it won't feature the fairy version of Eric Cartman. Also, apparently this book was supposed to celebrate the franchise's 10th anniversary, which, yeah, Happy to Charge would like to have a word with y'all. Anyway, the story we're gonna cover for today was written by Makoto Wakabayashi, an author who, to say the least, really likes their crossovers, in particular many toy properties, so needless to say, I'm a fan of theirs. Not to mention, they do have good taste when it comes to their FGO servants. Yes, I'm on Team Sakura phase. Why aren't you? Also, yeah, for our convenience, we're just going to be using some fan translations by a group called Doki Fan Subs. Normally, we would try to provide our own translations, but, you know, if there's translations out there that have been out for about a decade or so, may as well use them, right? Anyway, our story proper opened with the Doki Doki team facing down the Rock Akambe from Smile Precure. Obviously, they didn't recognize this monster type, and thus didn't know how to deal with it, but fortunately, they were saved by a new heroine in pink. Yeah, obviously, this girl was a stand-in for Kamen Rider Decade, who sadly won't actually appear in this book. Wakabayashi has done Doujinshi featuring him, but I guess they just wanted to focus on the Precure with this book, so it's understandable. And hey, at least he hasn't been disrespected as much as Toei has done to him. Seriously, why did Tsukasa's journey have to end with him looking like this? Anyway, they tried to introduce themselves to Cure Decado here, who they noted at least wasn't around during the events of New Stage 2. And like a representation of the Destroyer of Worlds, she was both unfriendly and quick to try and eliminate the competition. The Smile Precure team then just kind of came out of nowhere to provide backup, which Decado-chan referred to them as the weakest team. No, I'm pretty sure that debate is between the two food-based teams. Regardless, she was determined to become one of the most powerful Precure, which, for starters, I think you should get your hands on one of these things. But yeah, she had clearly become fairly jaded by the varying quality of the Reiwa era of Precure, which I can understand, but there had to be something or someone else pulling the strings, and of all baddies, it just had to be this clown.
Call the police.
I mean, okay, to be fair, if any villain deserved to be resurrected for a crossover film, Joker was at the top of the list since the Smile team never actually defeated him, and instead he just gave himself to his king, and this story did at least provide a very plausible reason for how this clown could return via a last-minute save by the big bad. In fact, it's a bit of a pity that ever since Deluxe 3, we haven't really seen the classic baddies return to at the very least act as the grunts to the main movie villain. I don't know if it has something to do with the
Voice actor budget!
Oh, shut up.
or some kind of arbitrary mandate that insisted they just focus on the movie villains, but come on, why can't we at the very least give a proper final one-on-one between Nodoka and Darizan is all I'm saying. Anyway, another benefit of these sorts of crossovers is allowing the villains to share, or more likely in this case, steal the abilities of their fellow evildoers. For Joker here, he managed to convert Decade-chan into a selfishness, aka Dark Decade, or violent emotion. Yeah, I don't know why this character has two evil forms. Also, while Joker refers to her as pure ego, or selfishness, different translations, we're sticking with Dark Decade-chan. Anyway, Joker started to fill the city with a Kanbei/selfishness hybrids. All the while, Mana tried to hold off Dark Decade-chan. And yeah, I'll be the first to admit, Wakabayashi's art style here is kinda simplistic, especially for something that's supposed to be an action manga. Yet, I still do really like this, if only for the epic setup. I mean, come on, it's basically the Precure doing their version of the Rider War. Not to mention, I do think they legit do faces really well. I mean, just look at some of these dead expressions on Dark Decade-chan. You can just feel the empty despair of a victim of two different Precure villain factions. They also did impact frames really well, as of course, the All-Stars started to pile in. They did their usual speeches of why to protect the people, the peace, and all that, which again triggered Little Miss Angsty here, which ended up confusing Mana and her lawful goodness. However, everyone's attention was then quickly taken up by Joker, who somehow was looking even creepier than usual as an amalgamation between him and his boss.
And they'll destroy us all to make it happen! Destroy us!
Not to mention, his hybrids had become an unending mob that even the Precure couldn't hold off forever. However, Yuki wasn't going to give up, even in front of this seemingly inevitable bad end, which, of all of her speeches to him, this was the one that actually resonated with this absolute psychopath. Okay. Still, to add to things, one more heroine that he didn't recognize came in the form of Ayumi. Though, don't worry about too much Joker, because I think due to some copyright issues, she's gonna be replaced with Kira Colgate. Anyway, like a good little Deus Ex Machina, she arrived with that thing that is actually returning in All-Stars F, the Miracle Lights. Here to fight off evil and COVID restrictions like there's no tomorrow. Also, hi former Desert Apostles. But okay, yeah, I don't mind the Miracle Lights too much here because one, it's just a book, so there's no actual performance or needless simulation of how the audience are supposed to use these things. And two, they did serve a very plot relevant and even kind of touching purpose with them reminding Dark Decade-chan of how she used to be a part of that crowd. Specifically, Deluxe 2 judging by Bumpy and the Kiryu sisters leading the crowd and admiring the newest lead at the time, Tsubomi, so at least this girl has good taste. And yet, even in spite of her dedication to the Precure, she also had to admit that she was the most background of background characters. Thus, that admiration for them soon turned to jealousy, as she could never be as powerful or as admired as them. This was likely what triggered her earlier lashing out, and was the source of the selfishness that Joker was feeding off of. Decade-chan realized that she wasn't worthy of being called a Precure, and yet the resident selfishness counselor was there to assure that what really mattered was the being of her heart and being who she wanted to be. This ended up dispelling both the emotional and monster selfishness from her heart. Admittedly, this is a rather short and simple redemption arc for an antagonist that's mostly been confined just to these 2 pages, and yet I would still say it's rather effectively done for a short story in the Doujinshi. Plus, this art is really well done. With that, Joker's influence started to dissipate, so Mana and Yuki went in for the final blow, with only the latter having a super form. Yeah, remember, the new stage films didn't debut any sort of movie-exclusive forms, and Mana's Engage and Paladin forms were still a ways away at the time. It would have been interesting if Wakabayashi had done their own thing, but I guess they also wanted to try and stick to canon, so I can respect that. Anyway, they defeated Joker and gave a bit more of a satisfying send-off to the character than in the actual show, as they assured him that no matter what sort of ending their franchise would get, they would welcome the next decade with open arms. The clown's mask symbolically shattered to acknowledge his total defeat, and maybe even hinted at him realizing that their words were kind of true. It's a good little bit of subtle ambiguity. With that, the manga ended with Decade-chan reflecting on what her heroines truly represented, and if she hadn't already become one herself, perhaps even looking forward to the day that she could join their ranks as the legendary warriors. This Doujinshi is a good example of how you can do a great crossover as long as you have a solid premise and writing down. It's a fairly short story at only about 30 pages, and yet in some ways I'd argue it captured the spirit of the Precure franchise better than 2/3 of the new stage films that came out around the same time. It goes to show, both in this story and in the creation of this very book, that sometimes all you really need is your passion focused in the right areas. The funny thing about Cure Decade is how the character uses more just the Kamen Rider's motif and doesn't really take any actual personality traits from Tsukasa Karuya, unless her weakness is a ticklish pressure point. Though that's not necessarily a bad thing, as Tsukasa's journey through the world served a very different purpose than hers. In many ways, she appropriately became a foil to Ayumi. Both were girls who admired the Precure, but couldn't find a healthy way to express it or apply it to their own lives. However, while Ayumi had Fuchan, who she'd eventually guide towards a bit of a forced face turn, Decade-chan had Joker, who guided her towards the dark side, as he always does with the magical girls. Thus, I think she had a much more interesting conflict as a fangirl who needed to be reminded of what the Precure stood for and how far she had deviated from their ideals by giving it her own selfish desires of trying to become the strongest, even though in her heart she knew she had become the weakest. As a result, it led to two featured cures in Mana and Yuki exposit their beliefs much like they did in New Stage 2, though to a much more interesting character than Raccoon Cartman. It was also awesome to see Joker get a much more climactic defeat and send-off than in his show proper. Again, I think it's just more interesting to at least call back to previous adversaries in this franchise to make it more feel interconnected, especially ones as memorable as the actually scary version of Sweet Tooth. But yeah, even though the art overall was simplistic and didn't allow for some great action scenes, it was still very appealing and cute and even allowed for some great facial expressions. The latter was especially important for getting across Decade-chan's arc in a limited number of pages and the emotions of the Precure as they celebrated their upcoming 10th anniversary at the time. There's really no better way of describing this other than as a heartful story that overall was very well told. We're still not sure what sort of role Cure Supreme is going to play in the upcoming film, pray to God it's not another twist villain, but if she can produce a story at least as half as engaging as this fan book, then this franchise should have a decently bright next decade to look forward to. With that though, we'll probably just get right into finishing up the final part of the Futai reviews. Be sure to come back when we look at the final quarter of that very flawed OG season, as well as check out our weekly reviews every Wednesday and Sunday on this channel. And until then though, for now my friends, and you know, just yelling louder isn't going to get your point across.